Daniel, welcome to the Fuller Evangelism and Church Planting class.
Thank you.
It
Yeah.
is great to have you. So tell us what you do.
Sure. Yeah, I'm a full-time apologist, evangelist, with a ministry called Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, based in Dallas, Texas. So for full-time, I answer and engage the big questions of life.
Excellent. And you do a lot of travel. Where do you speak? Where do you go?
Yeah, we do a lot of traveling. The hope really has been, as far as my job is considered, the hope has been to create more of a local presence for RZIM in Texas in particular. But nonetheless, still pulled for traveling quite a lot. And the main venues in which we speak is typically university settings. But kind of with my background, been able to tap into also the business sector as well. And so we like to speak at universities, churches, and then business sectors.
Excellent. So you were in the business world, and how did you get into this work of apologetics?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, since I was a new Christian, I've always been fascinated with the big questions. I mean, it's part of my journey. It's part of my conversion story. Is someone please help me wrestle with these questions, and kind of researching them on my own just made me, I think, a natural apologist for whatever I believed in. Either I was an atheist or I was a Christian. Felt like I needed reasons really to believe and give my life to this worldview. But pursued the business world instead of ministry, instead of anything else, for quite a long time, and found myself there in the business world also having major questions. Now that I'm a Christian, how does my Christian faith affect how I do business, affect how we do things in the business world? These topics of integrity, these topics of business ethics, if you will, just became massive questions as well. I feel like I've always wanted to answer the big questions, whatever arena or venue that I'm in, and the business world has definitely been one of the biggest ones.
And then so then you went to the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. Was it there that you said, "Okay, I really love this"?
Yeah, that was probably, so I did a program called the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics, a one-year program at Oxford University where you focus for about a year on studying the big questions of life from a philosophical and a theological point of view. Yeah. And I think there, it was an oasis for me. Loving the business world and loving, I'm an engineer by trade, but loving, all those things, really getting to go focus a year of my life, I just kind of was a stunned, somebody could do this for the rest of their life? Like, this is what I want to do. This is a dream, to do this at this kind of level, but also to be able to explain it to anyone. It's just a dream to do it. So now I wake up and pinch myself. It's a privilege and an honor to get to really do this for a living. But yeah, the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics was a massive, almost a wake-up call in a sense for me of, you are really called to this. This is really what your heart beats for, and how you are wired in a sense.
Yeah.
So,
that's great. Well, now, so we're talking to church planters this morning and seminarians, and they will not only be engaging the questions themselves, they will be calling on members of their congregation who are in the workplace, in the marketplace, out in their neighborhoods, at schools, and all kinds of settings to engage the questions. But I think people sometimes watch you guys, the amazing apologists, and say, "Wow, I could never do that."
Yeah.
What is apologetics?
Sure.
And why are we called to do it? And is it for the professional, or is it for everyone?
Great lineage of questions right there. First off, I love church planters and seminarians. I have a passion for church planting. If I wasn't an apologist, I probably would be a church planter. Just see the need and the necessity to plant churches as such a massive call for expanding and effective discipleship. One thing that we typically see, though, at least in the ministry that I'm involved in, is this question of how do you actually do apologetics? Well, we see you up on stage and we see you answer these questions well, and it seems like, but that's your full-time job. You get to do that for a living. You get to study that, essentially. But how do we, who also have to deal with pastoral counseling, perhaps as a church planter, and also have to deal with vision casting, also have to deal with, rounding the troops and creating, actual vision for multiplying disciples in a particular city, in an area. I mean, how do we then also deal with this topic of apologetics? It's just another add-on. Is there an easy way, essentially, to be an effective apologist as a church planter? Tim Keller talks about, as far as sermons go and preaching and church planters and seminarians go, he talks about apologetic sidebars. And what he means by that is whenever you're writing sermons, what he typically does is he has kind of bullet points in the side of his sermon where he inserts kind of an apologetic for the reasons why he's claiming something. I think the way that we get there, the way that we become effective apologists, is an answer that I don't know if people typically like to hear this, and maybe because our culture, our narrative typically is we want a quick fix, but the reality is it requires studying. It does require wrestling. And the way that we're going to be effective is wrestling with these big questions ourselves, I think in two areas, intellectually and personally. I think intellectually is quite a given. Typically people perhaps will talk about apologetics as the heady, the intellectual part of, the wing of Christianity that deals with just kind of the intellect, which I think is true, but also very incomplete. Now, that is a tenet, so let me just maybe explain that for a second. So intellectually, we want to wrestle with these questions. We want to show the world, if you will, that are asking these questions, the non-Christians who are asking these questions, to show them that we have a robust answer, to show them that we can actually provide an answer that has gone throughout centuries and has tested the times. In essence, that we can give a rational, reasonable defense for what we believe. It's not just, I was raised as a Christian. It's not just these maybe answers that we typically hear Christians get, and perhaps has given a bad rap, a bad name for Christianity. The answers perhaps that we've kind of succumbed to today. So we want to really be intellectually honest, intellectually rigorous in our pursuit. Absolutely. And so that requires wrestling, that requires studying. Just like if you were to be interested in a particular hobby, you would find yourself reading those books, sports, for example. You would watch ESPN. You would read the articles at night. You would be well versed in that area. I think the same goes for the cultural questions. It's not going to just come overnight. This answer comes. It's going to come with a real desire to answer. And some people just don't wrestle. Yeah. I just kind of point blank, some people don't wrestle with the questions and just seem to think that maybe, you've even heard, and maybe this is a bit controversial, the gospel is everything, or the gospel is enough. And the sentiment is right. The sentiment is, that's the power to salvation. Romans 1:16, we want to believe that unashamed. The gospel is the message of Christianity. But the gospel goes much further than just you're a sinner and you need salvation and you need redemption. It actually goes much further. What about these questions that are much, the gospel needs to be, in other words, we need to recapture the complexity, the profundity of the gospel. Yes. So a definition perhaps of what I've given to what apologetics is that apologetics, we're talking about the intellectual rigor, isn't just adding intellectual rigor, isn't just adding profundity to the gospel, not just cute new ways of how to make the gospel more profound. Apologetics at its essence is removing the barriers, removing the obstacles so that people can see the profundity of the gospel. That's the purpose, and that's the hope, is that we would be well versed enough to see that the gospel is profound. And as apologists, that's all we're doing. Is we're saying that's a barrier. Okay, we're going to come in, perhaps through the intellect, perhaps through the existential side, and we're going to remove that barrier so that you can actually see what the gospel is actually saying to you and to us as humanity, as a culture. The second area, though, yes, that we want to wrestle with So the first one is intellectually. I think the second area is personally.
Yes.
And this is an area I'm particularly passionate about because, like perhaps the sentiment goes is that apologists perhaps sometimes are just heady intellectuals and don't really have a heart, if you will, or can't really engage with me personally. You know, you hear of stories when it comes to the topic of suffering and the problem of evil, and the apologist coming back and basically saying, you know, the philosophical idea and why, you know, Christianity is robust philosophically and intellectually and this and that, and then, you know, you hear the story of someone raising their hand and said, that doesn't really answer me as a mother who just lost their child.
Yes.
What does Christianity have to say about that?
Yes.
I think apologetics is massively important in this area of dealing with the questions personally. And I think there's two avenues perhaps of this.
Yes.
And the first avenue is we're answering questions for people personally, existentially, that there's real heart issues. There's people that are struggling. There's people that are really hurting.
Yes.
And you could label this perhaps as a pastoral counseling, but it's even deeper than that. Perhaps it's a level of saying Christianity has answers for even the deepest longings and hurts for humanity, yes. And that's a big deal. That's a huge deal for Christianity to come in and say we're not just an intellectual exercise, but we're also going to answer the big questions of the heart.
Yes.
Now that's one area, but the second area with the personal aspect is, what does your life look like? Are your answers that you're giving, that the gospel is amazing, that the gospel is profound, that the gospel is life-giving, is it actually matching your life as an apologist?
Yes.
Are you actually living a life that, you know, is crying at the cross, at the foot of the cross? Are you living a Christian life in which, you know, we often say that at the center of every success needs to be humility.
Yes.
And you mark essentially the life of Jesus. As an apologist, you're not just giving intellectual, profound answers. You're giving answers that would be the kinds of answers that Christ would give. Humble, always looking for the betterment of that person kind of answers. You're wanting to see humanity flourish. You're not wanting to see them just go away and cast aside. We are for people. Just like God is for our joy, we want to be for the joy of people, no matter what they believe. So personally, that aspect of, are you actually living a life that is in accordance to what the answers that you're giving? I think it's massively important as an apologist. We are not going to survive, in other words, as church planters, as seminarians, as apologists, as people that are trying to give these big answers. We're not going to survive if we're just living hypocritical lives. I think that is not just obviously a challenge to the apologist. It's a challenge to the mom, to the dad, to the soccer coach, to the politician, to whoever might be. Integrity and living a life that is actually living in accordance to what the ethic you espouse, if you will, is massively important. So are we wrestling with these questions personally? Is our life actually matching up with these questions and how we answer them?
So in terms of wrestling, that is so good, and just how important that humility is, and to come with the posture of loving people and caring for people, and that's what we're doing.
Yeah.
We're removing those barriers so they can meet Jesus and have that healing. So what does it look like with, let's say, a church planter who says, okay, this is kind of the fundamental question my community is asking. Where do they start? What should they do in order to study? You call us to study. What do you do to study? What does it look like?
Yeah, great question. First thing I do is I engage that group, those people. And I want to sit them down and I want to have a round table. I mean, it's as simple as that. I mean, you hear of these kinds of things happening. You know, we want to engage, we want to have discussions, we want to have round tables. So if I'm in a culture and there's a question that I go, wow, you know what? I've actually never thought of how to answer this obstacle. That I don't know of anybody either that has been able to answer this question. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I want to sit down with these people and I want to be humble and I want to say, you know, tell me why Christianity, perhaps, what your obstacles are. tell me why Christianity actually doesn't feel like it is the right path for you. And then hear their obstacle, hear their barriers, and say, well, what about this? Oh, no, that doesn't work for us. Okay? And over time, you find yourself saying, you're refined. And you find yourself, the answers that you were given actually weren't as good as you thought. So that's one thing, is to answer the people and to actually sit down and be humble enough to say, we want to engage the community seriously enough to say, come over to our house and we want to have a round table. We'll make you dinner. We want to just talk, engage. We want to hear your thoughts. We think you have something to offer us, and we want to hear what you have to say.
Excellent.
Second thing, though, is, hey, we live in the digital age. We live in an age where you do have material at your fingertips, where you do have the ability to research and to look up people that I think would be helpful, other thinkers, if you will. And hopefully, through that research, you can find people that are actually giving good answers. So, the avenues and the resources that I typically go to are key for me to, I find myself, like you said, in a bit of a confusing topic of how do I engage this question. Well, other than engaging those people myself personally, I want to also go and do my homework. I want to also go home at night and I want to research. I want to reach out to perhaps local pastors who might have some insight themselves.
Yes.
I want to reach out to other Christians, other communities. You guys have anything to say on this, perhaps, or any resources you could point me to as well. And then just like, a hungry person would, devour it and go to town and figure it out and figure out how to do this well in a humble, loving way. You want to engage them for their soul. You don't want to win an argument. You want to engage them to see how does this Christian message actually going to come in and give these people more life.
Yes.
That's what we're claiming as Christians, that we have the message of life. We have the message that's going to give you more profound, flourishing life. Okay, well, right now I'm not feeling this, right? I'm not feeling like the culture is really believing this. But that's what we're claiming. So we have to figure out why. Why are we saying that? How does this actually make sense for us? And so that's where I would start, is kind of those three avenues.
Excellent. So, yeah. I the images of Paul of, pummeling his body.
Sure.
You see him, it's
sure.
like the apologetics, well, in anything we do in the Christian faith, if we want to go deeper and grow, it's like a workout.
Yeah.
It's a spiritual workout, and you have to put in, you just have to put in the time.
Yeah.
But I think some people will
Sure.
say, one thing I encourage people, that they don't even want to get into engaging the questions because they think, I'm not Daniel Rangel, or I'm not Ravi Zacharias, and I can't even begin to answer. But I just say, it's okay to not know how to answer. You can actually then just listening, engage in conversation, and then you can give them resources and say, I encourage you to look at this person.
Yeah, absolutely. As a former businessman, where most of my week in my life was consumed with business, I did not have the luxury, if you will, of getting to research as much as I get to now as a full-time job. I totally resonate with that, and I found myself several times thinking, this is the life of a normal, average day work schedule that doesn't get the luxury of getting to do this. How do I get to engage these big questions? And there's a couple things. Gosh, it's as hard as it is to say, do your homework, just kind of point blank. I think there's maybe some practical ways that I've found myself. If for example, when I was working in Houston, I had a commute, and typically what I tell people is redeem your commute. Use that commute that you are traveling maybe 30 minutes, 45 minutes to work. That's a good chunk of time where you actually can redeem that commute. And I know people typically do this, but maybe instead of listening to just music, perhaps change it up a bit and slowly start to build yourself a library of talks and resources that you want to listen to, and use that as a time to redeem your time. On top of that, there's avenues in which you can meet with people Have perhaps your Bible studies that you're a part of, or men's group. For me, for example, speaking as a man, having my men's group maybe orient themselves perhaps for a 4-week series or something like that. Maybe, guys, for 4 weeks we're going to just tackle 4 questions. Will you guys do this with me? Yeah, okay, let's do this. And then, you have 10 guys all going out looking at different resources. That's multiplication and exponential growth as far as all the resources that you could pull in and divvying up kind of how to answer these big questions. And hopefully the goal is by the end of that 4 weeks, you're not only more equipped, but you're also going, there's more questions. We want to answer them. Let's keep going with this. And the goal is hopefully to be able to engage those neighbors, engage those friends, the colleagues, the coworkers that we all have that we know aren't Christians. I think there's ways in which that I found really helpful. And if you are naturally inclined, as a church planter should be, perhaps as an evangelist, you're going to find yourself going, okay, I want to figure out how my time can be redeemed.
Yes.
How I can figure out how to really listen to these resources. I found a library. I see the plethora of information. Now how to ingest it. Okay, maybe create a schedule, maybe a discipline, once a day, something like that.
Excellent.
And that goes for the businessman as well. So.
Excellent. Yeah. And let's now move to the questions.
Sure.
The big questions.
Yeah.
What, and our students are coming from literally all over the world.
Yeah.
What are the top questions people are asking in your context?
Yeah.
And do you see some similarities when you talk to apologists from other countries and the nature of the questions? What are the questions?
Yeah.
The top ones.
Top ones. The top questions, they definitely vary by culture, obviously. Speaking in the context of perhaps America, one of the top questions I typically get is the topic of meaning and purpose. Is there meaning to life? And if there is, how can we find it? Living in South America for a lot of my life, that question is also quite high up on the list. But also the question that perhaps runs throughout the Americas is, why do we need God in the first place? Why do we need Him? Why can't we just be self-sufficient? Why can't you understand, if you will, the argument goes, that we know how to love each other now, that we know what is right and wrong, we know morality, we know how to fend for ourselves. So why do you need to posit this God that's supposed to give, this worldview that's just kind of an addition? Why can't we just love each other well and get on with it?
Yeah. How do you start to talk about that with someone?
Sure. So the way I typically start off by answering that question is, what are the alternatives, perhaps? So for example, if we want to adopt perhaps an atheistic worldview, what then is going to be the alternative to this topic of meaning and purpose? And I think what we've seen throughout the centuries and what we've seen even modern day atheists is saying that there is no ultimate meaning and purpose. Okay, so if that's the answer, what are now going to be the repercussions? So we want to talk about that. If there's no ultimate meaning or purpose or value to life, it's just a complexity of perhaps time plus matter plus chance, and that's why we're here, and we're here to kind of do our due diligence for 60, 80, whatever amount of years that we're allotted, and then we die and we burn, and that's it. I think of Dostoevsky. No, it was Tolstoy. Tolstoy, who in his book The Confessions, later in life, he found himself as an old man, living the life of an atheist for decades of his life, got everything. I mean, he's like a modern day Solomon. He had everything in his life that he ever wanted. And he found himself at the end of life going, nobody in my generation, in my friend group, and nobody that I talk to and all the people that I've met throughout life is willing to be undistracted, is willing to actually ask the questions that we don't want to ask. And the question that nobody wants to ask anymore is, what meaning has my life that the inevitability of death cannot ultimately destroy? That's the question that we don't want to ask. Why? Because we're too busy. And that's what Tolstoy said, is we're too distracted. We're distracted with this pursuit. We're distracted with this pursuit. We're distracted with this mantra or this narrative, but nobody actually wants to ultimately ask in other words, if the ultimate end is that one day the earth is going to burn up. One day, maybe millions or billions of years, but who cares? One day the earth is going to burn up and it's going to be ashes. And there won't be any rhyme or reason. What was the purpose of your little speck? What was the purpose of your little time? Ultimately, nothing. There was no meaning. There was no rhyme or reason. There was no difference between the Mother Teresa and the Hitler. I mean, that's what Tolstoy actually saw and said, okay, we need to deal with this as atheists. This is a big deal. If it means that my life, therefore, could be a Teresa or a Hitler, that's a big deal. And how we're going to shape society. And now somebody might say, well, we need to be good people. What about Tolstoy? He was remembered for his good deeds, wrote a book that was in top 3 Encyclopedia Britannica, is one of the greatest novels ever written. He's remembered for his deeds, but just for a bit, perhaps. But in the scope of the million or billions of years that this earth is going to live, he's going to be a speck and he will be forgotten, just like you and I. And so the topic of meaning is massive if we're going to take the logical implications, perhaps, of the atheistic worldview. So what does Christianity have to say? Well, Christianity actually has to say that you and I do have meaning, and that we actually want to validate, in a sense, the Tolstoy haunting question. We want to validate the fact that you are a vapor. We want to validate that you are a breath, and that's it. The Bible talks about how you are dew on the morning grass. You're here today, and you're gone today in the scope of eternity. Yes. I want to validate that, actually. But in the actual mist that you and I are, in the breath, if you will, that you and I are, or the morning dew, there is great meaning, and God actually values that speck. Yeah. He actually values and allots you a meaning that is so high, so valuable, that it gives you purpose and a drive to actually be the kind of person that you actually long to be. Actually validates you to be someone that this world actually is dying for. And ultimately, the ultimate meaning, if you will, is to know God. That's the ultimate meaning in life, is to acquire, if you will, a relationship with God, to acquire the Holy Spirit, to put it in another perspective. And when you do that, if the ultimate aim of life, and ultimate meaning of life, is to know the one who has fashioned you, well, the Christian worldview comes in and says, not just you get to know the one who has fashioned you, but you actually get to live a life that is full and abundant, in abundance and joy. Just like Christ said, I've come to give you life. I've given you life to the full. John 10:10. Yes. And that's what we're claiming. It's a massive claim, but it's a claim, I think, that has been tested. And it's what is fascinating is that you see all around the world this gospel message go and ignite a passion, and ignite meaning and value and purpose. Yes. I mean, the countless atheists that I meet with that say, I wish we had meaning. I wish the Christian message was true. But it's not. So we have to live a life of meaninglessness and purposelessness, and it drives us to despair. Yes. I think the Christian message that's what we commonly say, a message of hope. It's because we have a purpose and a hope that we're looking forward to in the future. So on top of atheism, we want to also look, when it comes to the question of meaning and purpose, we want to also look at the other world religions as well. The common, perhaps, question or claim that Christians get is, how do you claim, essentially, that Christianity is the only way, the only true path? What about these other world religions? How is it fair for you to say those kinds of things? I think the topic of meaning and purpose is absolutely essential to look into. And as Christians, as we're exploring these other world religions and what they have to say about meaning and purpose, you actually find yourself encouraged. Let me explain. You find yourself all the more interested in, wow, Christianity actually has an amazing answer to this. So take, for example, perhaps Buddhism, right? It's a major world religion. A lot of people in the East still following it, and we're seeing a growing number here in the West adopt. I was just in a taxi just 3 days ago with my taxi driver, American woman, who told me that she's now a full-on Buddhist, goes to the Buddhist conferences and so on and so forth. But the topic of meaning, so perhaps the central tenet, if you will, of Buddhism is to remove dukkha, right? To remove desire, We want to remove this desire. And once we can remove all humanly desire, then we can actually reach what's called nirvana. And if we can reach nirvana, that's the ultimate aim. That's the ultimate goal, if you will, of humanity. So much to the point of we want to remove dukkha, desire, that Buddha himself called his son, to translate his son's name, ball and chain, because his son, he desired, and he wanted to remove that. And if he could remove himself from all desire, then he could actually reach that nirvana. But what happens when you actually live that out fully? You find yourself not actually being able to fully desire and love what is actually good, what we would call things that are good. And so in one sense, you kind of hear this narrative in Christianity, the flesh, if you will. You want to, kill the desire of the flesh. The desires of the flesh are what is at the enemy of the desires of the spirit, and we want to kill those things. And so in one sense, again, Christianity wants to come in and validate the desire aspect of wanting to kill those kinds of desires. But the other side, Christianity comes in and says, actually, your desires are for a purpose. They're not meant to be fully exterminated and killed. Actually, God gave you desires, and gave you desire ultimately to be wrapped up in Him, to be found in Him. And that when your desire, when you find yourself ultimately found and wrapped up in finding all the pleasure, all the beauty, all the fulfillment, all the joy in God, which is what He claims to be, the supreme, if you will, holder of all fulfilling joys. If we find ourselves wrapped up in that, you find yourself going, this is the purpose of life. This, I'm actually flourishing. I'm actually living life to the full. So that's one example, perhaps. If you look at the meaning and purpose of other world religions, you find yourself going, Christianity actually has something very robust to answer and to give an alternative that makes sense to the human cognition.
I know we have students in unnamed Middle Eastern countries, part of this class, and students from India. Can you touch on, and I know I'm asking you to do the impossible, to do it in like a few minutes, but could you touch on Hinduism and Islam just a bit?
Yeah, okay, sure, I'll try my best. Islam, the meaning of life perhaps for a Muslim is to submit their wills to God, to be, worship Allah, and all glory to Him. He's the supreme, He's the absolute, and so we want to give all glory to Him. Now, what's fascinating about Islam is that Islam has so many similarities to Christianity, and Christians are afraid to say that, but it's true. We have a lot of similarities, but also radical differences, and we need to be also explicit about those things. I think one of the major differences, if you will, of Islam and Christianity is just the whole character, the idea of God. So that's a massive topic. But when it comes to, we use the same words, absolute, or, the sovereign, or, the all-powerful God. The major difference is the personal aspect, I would say. The view of Allah is that Allah is distant. He doesn't want anything to do with His creation. It's just hard for Christians to almost wrap their minds around, but He doesn't want anything to do with His creation. That's sin. He can't be near that. He is absolutely sovereign. He, in other words, He doesn't want to love. He has no interest in loving or knowing personally His creation.
Right.
Christianity is radically different. Christianity says we would want to validate, in a sense, that God is all-powerful, that He is sovereign, that He is God, He is supreme.
Yes.
But He's also driven by His love for you and I, so much so that He would break the barrier, that He would come down Himself and die the death that you and I deserve so that we could actually know Him fully. Now, it would be one thing to say, to know, so if you say perhaps to a Muslim, do you want to know Allah personally? There's a good chance, I've talked to several, dozens, hundreds of Muslims who say, no, of course not. I want to worship Him. He deserves all glory and honor. I don't want to know Him personally. That's terrifying. Well, the Christian God is quite different, isn't He? Because He's actually claiming, the Christian God is actually claiming to be the God of all love, the God of all, God is love, right? That's in our Bible. That's in our holy book, that He is the supreme pleasure of life. Okay, now, this is different. Now if we're claiming that this God now wants to know us personally, that's a new claim. So now we got to clarify that with the Muslim. We're not claiming that we want to know Allah personally or Muhammad personally. We're claiming to know the God of all supreme joy, the God of all supreme pleasure. If that God existed, wouldn't you want to know him?
Yeah.
Oh, well, all of a sudden that's a different kind of claim. That's a different kind of meaning and purpose. That's the meaning of life? Oh, that makes sense in a sense. You're right.
Yeah.
Now the topic of Hinduism
it's
is
really hard. We've been discussing in our class that a lot of our planters work with international students,
sure.
and then we do actually have some of our planters in the class in India. And this Hinduism is very hard because they affirm Christianity and say
very
that's
hard.
Good. Yes, we love Jesus, but how do we enter in with a Hindu?
Gosh, yeah, it's a massive. It is a tricky one. It's for me personally, it's been a major religion that has kind of been the religion with no backbone, if you will. Kind of like, we love Jesus, we worship him. He can be one of our gods as well.
Yeah.
And there's many routes, obviously, to go talking with a Hindu. One of them, perhaps, to kind of confront quite quickly is to say, well, Christ actually claims to be the only God. And that runs directly against the Hindu narrative, if you will.
Yeah.
That's going to be something that is, actually there's not thousands, there's not millions, there's actually just one, and he alone deserves your worship. In fact, one day you will bow down before him. Every knee will confess that he is the only God.
Yes.
Now, how do you now feel about that? How do you now go and explain that? Yeah. I think is what is interesting and is what is massively kind of complex. I had several coworkers in the business world who were from India, who were Hindu, and would always validate me, for being a Christian, who would always kind of clap and cheer me on for being a Christian and validate the character and the person of Jesus, and say that we really like him. He's a great guy. We want to worship him as well. That's a very confusing statement to say, especially for us Christians, where we come from, the monotheism. How can you be plural in this whole idea of God? And I think it is important to kind of call a spade and say, Christianity is not claiming the thousands and the millions, and there's repercussions to that. Perhaps the topic of reincarnation you could touch on, destiny, if you will. Yes. And we'll touch on this soon, but the topic of, where are we going after this life? That's not a question that just Hindus ask, but it's a question that every human being asks. What happens after death?
Yes.
I think Christianity's view of destiny, of where we're going, is a massive topic that actually gives clarity and gives a lot of hope for the Hindu, perhaps, much more than the reincarnation narrative. Now, so resources I would just jump at right quickly is my boss, Ravi Zacharias, coming from India, coming from the Hindu world. He's got books, Jesus Among Other Gods. He's got books that he's written, Conversation with Krishna, that I think have been massively helpful for how to engage personally, conversationally, the Hindu with the Christian worldview.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And if you look at the questions and the key questions that you get asked and your team, how would you narrow it down in kind of areas of questions?
Yeah. The top questions, like I said, we've touched on meaning and purpose, touched on how do we know that God can even exist, and let alone the theistic Christian understanding of God. How can you? It's one thing to claim deism, that there, maybe as a clockworker, that God created the world, but take a step back. But how can you go and jump from theism, and not just theism, but to Christianity? Yes. I think it's massive. The topic of science has become this resurgence. The amount of universities that I've spoken at where there's always, the token kind of scientists, if you will, the students who are studying. And I come from engineering world, and when I come back into that world and I go to those universities and I ask them, what their view of God is, the typical response is, well, we think science is, in essence, buried God, and we don't really need God anymore. Science is finding things out more and more. So the topic of science, I think, is massive. especially the resurgence of the new atheist movement, typically coming from the scientific world, kind of giving the name that Christianity is intellectually lax and doesn't really have any answers to give us. It's massive for us to really engage those big questions and uphold the Christian view. The topic of perhaps historicity, I think, is a massive one. Maybe even the Bible, to kind of just stick on that. The Bible gets a lot of rap today. It gets a lot of perhaps arguments against it. The Bible isn't historically viable. How can we actually trust that a bunch of guys wrote some things down and now you're calling it holy? Like, come on. It doesn't really claim those things. You can't really take those things as divine. You can't take those things as truth. It's just a bunch of guys that sat down and wrote some really good things. For example, I was with a couple of non-Christians the other day, and prolific atheists in our culture, and they said to me, if we could summarize the Bible, we would summarize the Bible by saying the whole Bible, in essence, in one sentence, is "Don't be a jerk." Now, that's fascinating because these weren't just everyday atheists. These were prolific atheists who have apparently, quote unquote, done their homework.
Yeah.
And not just that, but it got me thinking. I left that conversation going, I would probably put a lot of money on that. A lot of atheists today would say, yeah, that's a good way to summarize the Bible. We don't want to disgrace the Bible, so it's a good message, but we figured it out. We figured out, the Bible, we don't really need it anymore. We can kind of say to each other now, don't be a jerk. Oh yeah, that's the summary of the Bible. That's a summary of the other holy books as well. Now, what does that say, though, of their understanding of the Bible? The Bible's summary in one sentence is not "don't be a jerk." I mean, that actually is revealing quite a lot that they don't really know the actual narrative of the Bible.
Yes.
But they're kind of dumbing it down, perhaps, again, because of the abuses of the church, perhaps because of the kind of the dumbing down of pastors and kind of talks that we have given as Christians that have given a bad name for Christianity. Perhaps we need to own up to that. In other words, but that is revealing a lot. I think to say this is the summary of the Bible. So I think that's a massive question. The Bible. How are we going to actually come back and give a good defense for the historicity, the authenticity, the reliability of the Holy Scriptures? I think there's massive amounts of things to say. Incredible amounts of things to say. Scholars today from all types of schools today, universities, Ivy League, Oxford, Cambridge, Durham, that have constantly and been giving robust answers to the validity of the Scriptures. If you look into it, there are amazing things to say to our non-Christian friends. Those are some of the big questions. I'm thinking of other ones, perhaps.
And you said you could really categorize the questions in 4 areas. What are those 4 areas? Yeah, so in all my talks, in all of our talks, even at RZIM, and Ravi would say this as well, and he's the one that has coined this essentially, is in all of the questions that we've ever gotten, they typically land, no matter what the question is, they typically land in 4 categories. And it's the questions that deal with origin. Where do we come from? Where do we come from? Origin, where do we come from? Yeah. Okay. Morality. Yes. How do we know good from evil? Yes. The questions of meaning, which we've touched on. Yes. Questions of meaning and purpose, and how do we know? How can we find that? And then questions of destiny, which we touched on a little bit ago, talking about Hinduism. Those 4 questions, no matter really what the question is, they have to do with these 4 topics. And so we really want to major on those. We want to actually see how does Christians... Now, it's one thing to understand what the culture is saying on those 4 topics, but also, how do Christians now answer these? How do you have an answer? I'm talking, do you, as the church planter, as whatever it might be, do you have an answer? If I were to say, what does Christianity have to say about origin? And you could say, oh, God created us. But what does that have to do? Like, how is that going to answer? How is that going to help us propagate? How is that going to help us move forward the kingdom of God? It's one thing to say, yeah, God created us. But how is that actually going to help us against the claims and the arguments against Christianity? The questions of morality and meaning and destiny. Why are those big topics? And do you have an answer? Not just an answer, but an answer that goes directly towards the questions that the culture is asking.
He's massive.
So let's just review again.
Yeah.
Origin.
Meaning.
Morality.
Destiny.
Yeah. Destiny.
Yeah.
That is so. I guess I've one final question.
Yeah.
N.T. Wright said that the prevailing worldview is consumerism and capitalism, and
Yeah.
I hear a lot in particularly in American culture of
Yeah.
I'm gonna get to God eventually.
Sure.
I meet with God, I can do that sitting in my armchair.
Mm-hmm.
How do we break through to that person and explain the sense of urgency?
Yes. Yeah. It beats on my heart. It's a big question. Yeah. First thing I would say is there is a feast in which you are missing out on. So this type of answer to say I'll get to him. This is my own family who says this to me quite often. We'll get to him once we get to that age, maybe retirement. Even my own father has said retirement will be for me and God. But right now I've got business to do.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to me. It's absolutely mind-blowing to say, okay, if the Christian worldview, if the Christian narrative, if the Christian message is saying that there is a feast waiting for you now.
Yes.
Not in the future, but now. Why are you robbing yourself? Why are you waiting?
Yes.
To dive into that feast?
Yes.
And that feast, not just the physical feast, obviously, that will come one day in heaven, the great supper. I mean, that's going to be amazing, the wedding feast. I'm talking about now, the feast that is existential, the feast that is serving your soul. Yes. That Christ comes and says, I've got a feast for your soul, just like the woman at the well says, I've got the water. And she says, all right, give it to me. And he says, no, I've got the water of life. All right, great. I wouldn't mind not having to come back to the well. So if you could give me that water, that'd be great. No, you don't get what I'm saying. I'm talking about the thirst and the quench that your soul is after. I've got that water. I've got that feast. Oh, we start proclaiming this kind of message, that Christianity is offering you a feast now, and wants the best for you now, wants joy for you now, flourishing of life now. I mean, to me, it's like, why wait, man? Why wait another minute?
Yes.
Figure it out. And so it's something, I'm not saying become a Christian now. Perhaps, obviously, I've said that before, but at least investigate. Yes. At least explore. If this is the message of Christianity, explore. Like, oh, there's a feast. Christians are claiming a feast for me. Yes. I'll say that over and over and over again. Somebody asked me the other day in a Q&A panel, what is it that what is it that we as non-Christians will miss out on, if there is no heaven or hell? And I said, you're missing out on a feast. And I think it's absolutely imperative to keep claiming that Christ is offering you and I a feast to our souls, to say, man, explore me, investigate me, come, investigate, follow, figure me out, see if I'm actually real, see if this feast really is real, see if this thirst for your soul is actually real and actually has veracity to it. Yes. See if it actually can offer you anything. If it doesn't, all right, you're done. You can move on if you will. Yes. But what I think you will find if you investigate is that Christ is offering you the very answers to the questions of your soul. The very things that you and I and every human being, despite culture, despite age, despite demographic, are asking these questions. And Christ says, I know exactly those questions, and I've come to fulfill them, and I've come to give you life to the full. That's what you're missing out on. So why wait? Go for it.
Excellent. Thank you, Daniel. I'm going to shake your hand, absolutely. And then I'm going to ask you, can you just give a final word to our students?
Yes.
Thank you so much. This has been fantastic.
Thank you for having me. Final words to the students. The biggest thing I want to say is, obviously, study and do your homework on these questions. But more than that, your life, your personal life with the Lord, your personal walk with the Lord, as an apologist, as someone who engages culture, the number one question that people often are asking is, what does that Christian's life look like behind the scenes? I remember a story that Ravi actually gave one time where he's talking about a woman who was a non-Christian came with a Christian friend to one of his talks. And she brought her non-Christian friend, and they listened to Ravi talk, and they listened to Ravi field questions for about an hour, and it was great. And at the end of the talk, the Christian friend asked her non-Christian friend, how did you make of it? How did you find it? And the friend said, impressive, deeply impressive. But I wonder what his life looks like. That's the question we're asking, is ethics. What is the ethic you espouse? If you read even Plato's Republic and you read Ethos, the question that Aristotle was posing was, whenever anybody is giving you an ethic to espouse, to live by, and that's what you and I will be doing as ministers of the gospel. The question is not, what is the ethic they espouse, what is the ethic they live by? That's the question that we want to answer. We want to live authentic Christian lives. We want to live lives that are actually representing a life that is in love with Christ. Are you in love with Christ? Are you just one of those other seminarians, other pastors, other church planters that is giving the answers but doesn't actually have the life to back it up? Get your life in order before you get into ministry. Don't think that it's just going to happen all of a sudden. You don't stumble into godliness. It is a progression of time, and it's a focused, laser-focused progression that you need to be constantly aware of. So stay humble. Remember, at the center of every success is humility. Live your life like Christ would live, humble, at the foot of the cross. Cry, weep. Weep before God, asking Him to fill your cup every day. So your personal life is absolutely essential. It is key to how you're going to be a minister. It will answer all these questions about burnout, all these questions that we often talk about in ministry all the time. Get your personal life in order. And then start talking about how do we engage the culture. And take that aspect unbelievably seriously. Take it so seriously. The culture is asking questions like never before. And it's a privilege and an honor that you and I get to actually study and get to look into how are we going to engage these questions. How are we going to love our non-Christian friends by giving them answers. Not just with our lives, which is major, but also with our mouths and with our brain and with our heart. How are we going to engage these questions? So let's study together. Let's take these questions seriously. Let's wrestle together. Let's give each other resources. But let's also ultimately give our hearts and our lives and surrender our lives to Christ daily, day in, day out. That's my encouragement. Thanks for listening.